Hello, welcome to our interview about the sovereign cloud stack. I'm Friederike, editor-in-chief of the Cloud Report, and today I have the pleasure to talk with Kurt Garloff, technical leader of the project, and Felix Kronlage-Dammers from the OSB and grinscale. But please introduce yourself and tell me and us what is the sovereign cloud stack.
Will do. Felix, why don't you start?
With introducing. So I'm Felix. I'm responsible for the engineering at grinscale, a German cloud vendor, and also a long-term member of the board of directors at the Open Source Business Alliance. And as such, I'm also part of the SCS task force within the Open Source Business Alliance. And because the sovereign cloud stack is such an interesting project, I also brought grinscale to the table, and why will be elaborated in the course of this interview. So, Kurt.
Thanks, Felix. Yeah, my name is Kurt Garloff. I've been a long-term open source supporter, so I've started really doing Linux kernel development in the 90s. I've been working for a long time at SUSE, where I built up SUSE Labs, and was then also involved in some of the strategic work we did at SUSE with partnerships, SAP, for example. 2011, I turned my attention to cloud and built a few open source clouds. The most famous one probably being the Open Telecom Cloud, where I was the leading architect to get it launched and also tend to develop it further and make sure our customers are happy. Since the end of 2019, I'm involved in this project, Sovereign Cloud Stack, which was an idea between Rafael Laguna, who is the founding director of the German Agency for Disruptive Innovation, and Peter Ganten, who is the chairman of the board of the Open Source Business Alliance, and Oliver Maus, who was the CEO of Blue Server. And we had this idea that in order to make Gaia X successful, we need to also make sure there is some attention on sovereign infrastructure. And that is really what the Sovereign Cloud Stack project is about. And I've been working on that project since early 2020 when we joined Gaia X. And we were lucky enough to be to receive some research money from the Agency for Disruptive Innovation, and now also from the German Ministry for Economy and Energy. So that's me. Should I share my screen and tell you a bit more about Sovereign Cloud Stack?
Yes, please.
All right. I hope you can see the slide. The project is hosted by the Open Source Business Alliance. We received money from the Ministry for Economy and Energy. As you can see on the logos, we are part of Gaia X, and we also have our own logo. I personally am an employee of the Open Source Business Alliance since a few months, as are the other persons listed on the author list, Manuela Urban, Dirk Lossack, and Eduard Dietrich. Just quickly what we are trying to do. So we observed that the hyperscalers have a dominant position in the cloud market, and actually it's getting worse if you think that having a situation where a few companies dominate the market is bad, which we do. Because it creates a lot of centralized control over platforms, over data access to these companies. And for customers, obviously, it creates dependencies. They depend on those companies in an economic way. There's a strategic dependency and also some legal challenges around it if you think data protection or the Schrems judgment. So there's some trouble, and it actually creates a barrier to digitalization in Europe. And of course, also, if you think more geostrategically, the fact that growing part of the value creation moves outside of Europe is not what Europe should be interested in. Looking for alternatives is something that people do and that we should do. And I mean, the observation we have is that there's a lot of good open source out there. A lot of the building blocks are available that you need to build alternatives, but unfortunately, putting all those building blocks together in a consistent way and in a way that you can manage it well is difficult. It's very difficult. It requires quite a number of highly skilled people, and we see that such efforts are being pursued in a number of companies, cloud providers, as well as research institutes, and also sometimes IT departments of companies. And they all build and run their own stacks out of those mostly same building blocks. And that's a pity, because a lot of work is done multiple times. And also bad is that the result of that integration work also results in slightly different and slightly incompatible stacks. So we also fail to build an ecosystem with a standard. And we're trying to address really both of this as Sovereign Cloud Stack. We really try to define standards. So one way to put those components together, and then also want to share the work with all those companies of putting the stack together. So we end up with a standard and as well a reference implementation to be built together. And maybe one important remark here is also that it's not just about the integration of a working stack, but also all of the work that's required to operate such a stack. Because that's actually more difficult than building it in the first place. Day two operations really is a big challenge for such platforms. So by having also standardization and collaborative work on the operational topics, on the operations tooling, on the automation of it, on the documentation of operational processes is really important to us. And the end result, of course, then in our vision is that we do not build like one big company in Europe that competes with the US or Chinese hyperscalers, but really to have a federation of many small, medium-sized, also large providers building a platform that users can choose and can also easily move from one to another, or move some of them together, of course, as well. So that's why federation is such an important topic for us.
I would actually like to chime in here, because this is a very good place to quickly elaborate on why the Sovereign Cloud Stack fits so well into the open source business alliance. For once, we already touched the term of open source software a few times in the few minutes that we went into the interview now, but also another term, sovereignty, is very important. And the Open Source Business Alliance sees itself as that one organization in Germany that actually pushes forward digital sovereignty. And digital sovereignty means that me as a customer of a cloud solution actually has the choice between vendors without being tied to a certain vendor by a technical lock-in. Personally, I can personally choose a vendor because I like the quality, but if I'm not happy with the service anymore, I should have the option to actually move away without technical limitations. So that's in a very few sentences why this fits together very well. And with that, I would hand back to Kurt, because he can actually give a timeline on what has happened.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. Just maybe a very quick description of the project itself. So we started in early 2020, joined GaiaX, and were finally successful to get some funding from the German Ministry for Economy and Energy a few weeks ago. And the project really is hosted by the Open Source Business Alliance, which is a great fit, as Felix just outlined. And the way the project is set up is that we really want to hire a small central team into the Open Source Business Alliance, a central team that really serves to orchestrate, to coordinate all the work that needs to be done, and also to have this neutral ground in the center of all those companies that contribute. So we have money to pay the employees of the Open Source Business Alliance. We obviously have a growing community of engineers that contribute to the project. We also have some money in that project to fund some of the development work that needs to be done. Sometimes there's work that is not necessarily fun to do or beneficial for a single company, so we need to have the ability to pay for it. I mean, let's maybe use continuous integration and testing as one example where we expect to be required to pay, or maybe penetration testing is a topic where you need highly skilled individuals that expect to be paid for their work. So that's what we can do with the money we have from the funded project. We have a growing ecosystem of companies that do contribute. You see some of the logos on the slide. I mean, the largest companies on that slide being T-Systems and OVH, but a lot of small and medium-sized companies as well, like PlusServer, who was one of the founding partners for this project, City Network, which is a Swedish cloud provider, Cloud and Heat, which is a great company from Dresden, grinscale, where Felix actually works, Stack HPC, which is a UK company. So we are not limiting ourselves to European Union people that can contribute. And then, of course, also companies on the that come from the open source space. So it's actually not even all logos. It's growing actually every week, so hard to keep up with it. Yes, and with these partners, we're building the software and also the standardization. We are happy to report that we already did release the first release. We called it Release 0 because it was actually a lot of the work that was done actually prior to the start of the officially funded project. That was pushed out in July, and we have the next release upcoming in September. From there on, we will have half-yearly releases. So we have a really time-boxed development model where you can rely on our schedule, but then, of course, some of the features may be up for negotiation, depending on how well the development turns out to work. The first release, or Release 0, was really focused on getting some of the foundation in place, all of the automation to put infrastructure management, infrastructure as a service pieces in place. And the second release now is really focusing on the container stack and the federation pieces. I guess I'll finish the presentation here so we have some time for questions and discussion.
Yes, thank you. Felix mentioned it already, or mentioned some arguments for open source, but why is open source so central and so important for the project?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things we do is we are really competing with some giant companies. I mean, if you look at what the hyperscalers claim to invest into R&D, those are huge numbers. And there's no way you can compete with that as a single company. So you need to build a network of companies that work together in order to be able to build impressive technology. And the open source community actually has proven to be able to do that. I mean, there's an operating system these days which is dominant, maybe except for the desktop market, that runs almost all of the internet, which is Linux, which has been able to compete with a giant like Microsoft. And we see the same thing in the cloud space. So we can build on a lot of great work from a lot of global open source communities. So in order to be able to do that, we need to be part of those communities. We need to contribute to those communities to really leverage that. If you think about it more from a customer point of view, obviously, you want to trust the platform you're using, and the transparency you have from open source projects is important to that. So customers can actually check that the infrastructure does what it's advertised to do. If they want to, they can actually look at the code, they can change it, they can contribute to it, they can get involved. I mean, we have an open development model where we try to be very transparent, not just the code that comes out of it, but also the process to develop is transparent. And in the end, I think open source is then not just the tool for those companies to collaborate on developing the code, but we also want to go a step further and establish a model that we call open operations, where we also want to create transparency on those operational tools, on the operational processes. So this knowledge that needs to be built on operational topics also can be shared and collaboratively advanced.
I would like to add another facet that might be obvious to very open source minded people, but I still want to add that is also that of course the results of the SCS project, aside from all the reasons that Kurt mentioned, they also need to be open source because it's funded with public money. So public money means public code. which is a very, very important item. And that should actually, I mean, we have now with, for example, the Corona Warn app in Germany, another good example where actually something that has been funded with public money is actually put out into the public space. But we have also a lot of bad examples. So that's actually also a very good example now with STS, that actually things that are paid by public money should be public code. Alongside, and that's between the lines, that what Kurt said is that open source has shown in the past 30 years to be the superior model of developing software. I mean, Linux, which just turned 30, has basically put every commercial Unix vendor, aside from macOS, out of business. And that's and it's powering all the large clouds. So yeah, you're not agreeing, Kurt, because you were.
I'm talking to IBM people sometimes, and they always tell me that AIX is still alive. So
yeah, well, yeah, it is.
They have their niche. They are alive.
And I actually I'm a BSD person, and I still see how, and that's all open source. But basically, the open source operating systems have shown their great value and their superiority in that regard.
No, I agree.
Coming back to the SCS and the open source project, every open source project has its own community, and you already mentioned the companies who are contributing, but do you have also a community around the SCS? And if so, how is this organized?
So the short answer is yes, we do.
Great.
A bit longer answer is, so you have seen some of the contributors and which companies they come from. So indeed, it's anybody who is interested in this project to be successful, also interested in maybe using the outcome of this project, or any other reason, can join the Sovereign Cloud Stack community. And joining really means one of many possibilities. So we are happy for everybody that contributes to one of the upstream projects that we're using. So this is, of course, helpful for us. We're also very happy if people get involved directly with the work we're doing, which is mostly about integrating those upstream projects. All of the work we're doing is visible on GitHub, so people can access the code there. They can raise issues, they can ask questions, they can read the documentation, they can suggest improvements for the documentation, for the code, issuing pull requests. And we really, it's important for us to really be responsive to those questions and requests, so we can really onboard people that come via that route. What we do in addition is also we have a number of people that regularly contribute, and those are the ones from the companies I listed. And what we do with them is we have weekly video meetings where we try to plan the work that we do during the next week. So it's a bit Scrum-like, where we do a sprint planning with weekly sprints. We have task boards where we go through the various tasks together and prioritize and discuss who could work on which of these tasks to move forward with those user stories. So it's a bit Scrum-like. We're fully distributed, we're international. Anybody who wants to join is welcome, really there.
Yeah, the meetings are in English as soon as a person joins that is non-German speaking. So of course, all that stuff is in English as well. And a usual side note here, in order to join and help with the project, one does not need to be a programmer or just do hardcore technical work. So there's lots of stuff to do that does not require deep technical work. So on all levels.
Yeah, very true. So one of the things we do with people that ask, well, how can I join? We offer onboarding calls for them. So we really have a discussion and try to understand, okay, what are the interests of somebody who wants to join? What are the skills that somebody brings? So we can kind of better guide how to get started. This is not a requirement. People can join without the onboarding call as well, but we offer that because typically it's helpful for people to get started quickly.
Maybe we could offer some contacts here in the video or in the description of the video too, so that the audience can get in touch with you.
Yeah, definitely. So I do have, I think the slides are still being shared, I guess.
They are.
So we have some contact data on the last slide. We have a webpage, scs.community. That's, I guess, the go-to place to kind of learn a bit more about the project. There's contact data there as well. I also have an email address there. So it's, yeah, we're not trying to hide, definitely not. We're trying to be very, very easy to connect to.
Great. So maybe a little technical question. You mentioned you included some open source projects, and which are they, and why do you integrated them?
Yeah, so I'm not capable to give you a complete list, because the amount of software that is being used to build such a complete cloud and container stack and all the management tooling around that, it's hundreds of different software projects. So in the end, a lot of the projects come from the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, where we have, of course, Kubernetes as maybe the most prominent project, but also, for example, the Prometheus monitoring framework that we're using in the stack. A lot of tools in the container space really are from those communities around the CNCF. We are using OpenStack on our infrastructure layer to manage the infrastructure and automate all of that. That's, of course, the open, well, actually, it's not the OpenStack Foundation anymore, as denoted on the slide. It's the Open Infrastructure Foundation. They have rebranded because they are actually having a broader scope than just OpenStack. Some project hosted by the Linux Foundation. There's also some projects that are not belonging to any of those foundations and just have their independent community. How have we chosen them? So one of the things we do is, when we look at open source projects to integrate, is a few things. One of them, of course, we have like this vision of which pieces you need to put the stack together. So we have an architecture diagram, and then often you do have a choice of several projects that could fill in a specific role. And we have something developed that we call open source health check. So we look at those projects, we try to judge the maturity of the project. So that's like more on the, is the code base working well? Is it tested? Are the tests included in the code base? Do they actually have good CI practices in place? But then also try to make sure we avoid some of the risks. So we look at the license, we look if there is a community behind that that's healthy. Is it diverse, or is it maybe a single vendor project? And then depending on those criteria, we also do a little bit of a risk assessment. What happens if this company decides to, whatever, change their license and do something strange because they feel intimidated by Amazon or so, like whatever Elasticsearch did recently. So we're looking at those things and try to choose projects that are not single vendor, so we don't have that risk. Or sometimes if we don't have that choice, we try to think of, okay, do we have alternatives in case a company goes bad? Can we fork the project? Do we have the skills actually to develop it ourselves and maybe build a community that carries the software forward? Or can we maybe replace it if needed? So those are things we look at.
That sounds very reasonable. Yeah, I just have one topic in mind. Another big topic for Europe or Germany is sustainability. How this topic is covered by the SCS?
Yeah, so sustainability, I see a few aspects of sustainability. So one of the observations we have is that the way software development evolved during the last decade, or maybe even decades, is very, very quick. So a lot of the requirements, expectations that modern software developers have radically changed how we look at infrastructure. So we look at those microservice architectures these days, where you need a cloud or container stack in order to serve them. So one of the things we try to do is to build a stack that is fairly static at the bottom layer, at the foundation, and very, very dynamic at the top layer where the developers work. So we can very, very quickly react to whatever. If the next paradigm shift comes and all of the engineers want to develop towards maybe serverless or function as a service or maybe web assembly kind of applications, we can do that. We can very quickly change those platform components at the top of our stack without having to revolutionize or reinvent everything at the bottom layer. So we try to build a bottom layer that doesn't need to change every year in order to fulfill the developer requirements. And that kind of makes the architecture sustainable, because we don't need to rip out everything every year. And having said that, that actually also gives us then the opportunity to optimize the stack, because we're not completely absorbed with reinventing it all the time. We can actually spend some time optimizing for performance, optimizing for energy efficiency, and doing these things that we need. And I mean, one of the companies that we have in our group is Cloud and Heat. They are trying to kind of use the extra heat for secondary purpose. I think that's a really nice approach to energy efficiency. But of course, also just the classical energy-saving technologies like using sleep states and stuff is possible. It sometimes requires a bit of work to do it in a way that you don't lose performance, and that's why some of the data center providers don't do it, but it can definitely be done. And that's why what I mentioned, this stability in the architecture, is important. Also, one of the things we have on our roadmap is actually to look into non-x86 architectures. So, I mean, there are a lot of people that consider ARM and also RISC-V technologies as having a lot of potential to be maybe more energy efficient. And this is something that we have on our roadmap, to look into those hardware architectures and to support them. Yeah, I guess that's what I have on energy efficiency and sustainability.
So thank you for your insights and the information about the sovereign cloud stack. I do not have any questions anymore, but did I forget to ask an important question? Do you want to add some things?
I guess if you ask me, what I would add is a request. I mean, if this is interesting to you, please join our project, contribute to it. We do appreciate people that want to join the community, contribute. We're also looking for people that actually join the Open Source Business Alliance. We have open positions. We're looking for companies that want to maybe also offer their services in some of the public tenders we're doing, where we said we can actually also pay for some of the work that needs to be done. All of this is really appreciated, because I think the larger we grow, the better our ability to really build great technology and also to be successful and build an ecosystem that can compete with the large hyperscalers.
We will spread the word. So thank you for your time.
Well, you're very welcome, and it was actually fun.
Thanks a lot for inviting us.